given horrifying scenes this week in Gaza with brutal beatings of journalists and academics by Hamas.
The United Kingdom made clear some time ago that in relation to item 7 of the Human Rights Council's determination, we would move to oppose those items, and we expect to do so. In relation to Gaza, the situation is that the International Commission was not able to investigate non-state actors, but there is no doubt that the situation in Gaza was serious, as has also been determined by Israeli authorities, and the United Kingdom will maintain its position in relation to that.
Finally, Adrian Bailey.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the case of a no-deal Brexit, the Minister has given some limited assurances to NGOs accessing funds from the EU's humanitarian fund that they will underwrite them in future. Can the Minister say whether they will be prepared to do the same for NGOs accessing funds on more broader humanitarian work?
Yes. I thank the honourable gentleman for raising this important point. Yes, we are looking at widening that support. Our NGOs, whether they're humanitarian or work in other areas, are world class, and we would want them to be able to continue to work in those settings. So we have issued those guarantees. But I would say to the honourable gentleman that if he ever gets the opportunity, he knows what he can do to avoid a no-deal scenario.
Thank you. Order. Questions to the Prime Minister. Pete Wishart.
Number 1, Mr. Speaker.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I am sure that the whole House will want to join me in condemning the appalling and cowardly attack in Christchurch on Friday. There can be absolutely no place in our societies for the vile ideology that drives hatred and spreads fear. I spoke to Prime Minister Ardern on Sunday. I told her that we stood with New Zealand at this time and we would provide whatever assistance was needed. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank the emergency services for their handling of the terrorist incident in Stanwell on Saturday. I'm sure members from across the House will want to join me in sending our thoughts to the man who was injured. And I would like to send my deepest sympathies to the families of those killed and those injured in Utrecht on Monday. We're in regular contact with the Dutch local authorities and are standing by to offer whatever assistance is required. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm sure that members will want to join me in expressing my deepest shock at the loss and devastation caused by the cyclone in Mozambique, Malawi and Zimbabwe. We have made, as I think has been made clear by the Secretary of State in International Development questions, we've made £6 million of UK aid available to help meet the immediate needs of people who've lost everything, and we've deployed a UK team of DFID experts to coordinate our response to this disaster. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Pete Wishart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I totally associate myself with everything the Prime Minister has said? We will never allow hate to succeed, and we do stand in solidarity with the victims of Cyclone Edie. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's deal lies in tatters. Her cabinet is in open revolt. She presides over the biggest constitutional crisis this nation has experienced. And where leadership is required, she has once again cravenly caved in to her hard Brexiteers and will now only seek a short extension to Article 50, contrary to the expressed will of this House. When will she develop a backbone and stand up to those that would take this nation to disaster? And as one of our ministers said this morning, referencing another feeble Prime Minister, weak, weak, weak.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Perhaps it would be helpful in response to that question if I update the House on the forthcoming European Council and the issue of Article 50 extension. On Thursday, the House voted in favour of a short extension if the House had supported a meaningful vote before this week's European Council. The motion also made it clear that a longer extension would oblige the United Kingdom to hold elections to the European Parliament. Mr. Speaker, I do not believe such elections would be in anyone's interests. The idea that 3 years after voting to leave the EU, the people of this country should be asked to elect a new set of MEPs is, I believe, unacceptable. It would be a failure to deliver on the referendum decision that this House said it
Order. The long way to go, and what the Prime Minister is saying must be heard. The Prime Minister.
I have therefore this morning written to President Tusk, the President of the European Council, informing him that the UK seeks an extension to the Article 50 period until the 30th of June. Copies of the letter are being placed in the libraries of the House. The government intends to bring forward proposals for a third meaningful vote. If that vote is passed, the extension will give the House time to consider the withdrawal agreement bill. If not, the House will have to decide how to proceed. But as Prime Minister, I am not prepared to delay Brexit any further than the 30th of June.
Will the Prime Minister welcome Oil and Gas UK's report today predicting 200 billion of new investment in the sector, supported by this government's fiscal policy, in direct contrast to the SNP failure to stimulate the Scottish economy?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend that the Chancellor's spring statement last week showed that this is indeed a government that is delivering for Scotland. He mentions the issue of fiscal policy and oil and gas. We've also put £260 million for the Borderlands growth deal, £68 million extra in Barnet consequentials for the Scottish Government, £79 million for a new national supercomputer at Edinburgh University. While the SNP is obsessed with independence, it's this Conservative government that is focused on growing Scotland's economy.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to start by sending my condolences to all the families and friends of victims of the terror attack in New Zealand last week. The terrible events in Christchurch should remind us all there is no place for hate, and I pay tribute to the way in which Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern has responded with such dignity and such compassion to this crisis, and I absolutely agree with the comments of the Prime Minister concerning the events at Stanwell and Utrecht. And I'm sure the whole House will join me and her in sending our deepest sympathies to all those who lost their loved ones and homes in the terrible cyclones that have caused devastation in Mozambique, Zimbabwe and Malawi. I support the government in sending £6 million of aid. I hope if more aid is required, we will be able to respond urgently and generously to any demand for help from people that are so desperately suffering at the present time. Mr. Speaker, we're now in the midst of a full-scale national crisis. Incompetence, failure and intransigence from the Prime Minister and her government have brought us to this point. Parliament has rejected her deal. It's rejected no deal. The Prime Minister now has no plan. In an effort to break the deadlock, I've held meetings with members all across the House, and I'm having further meetings today to find a compromise that supports jobs and living standards. Tomorrow, I'm meeting EU Prime Ministers and officials in Brussels. This, Mr. Speaker, is a national crisis. Will the Prime Minister meet me today to discuss our proposals as a way forward to get out of this crisis?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, it's a bit rich him standing up and inviting me to meet him when for days and days he refused to meet me. And when for days and days he refused to meet me, and he then refused to allow the Shadow Brexit Secretary to have a further meeting with the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Of course, I'm always happy to meet members across this House to discuss the issue of Europe, but I do note that opposition party leaders, when they came out from the meeting with the Leader of the Opposition, made it clear that what they didn't want was Brexit. We should be delivering Brexit for the people of this country.
Jeremy Corbyn.
I'm not sure there was an answer to my question there, actually, Mr. Speaker. I wanted no deal taken off the table. The House has taken no deal off the table. It's time the Prime Minister took no deal off the table. Mr. Speaker, the CBI said the extension vote is a welcome dose of common sense. Put in place a new process, drop the red lines. Every MP must show leadership through compromise. Will the Prime Minister drop the red lines? Is she prepared to compromise to get through this crisis?
The right honourable gentleman talks about decisions that have been taken by this House. I'm sure it won't have passed you by, Mr. Speaker, that of course this House has voted on and rejected a second referendum. It has voted on and rejected no deal. It has voted on and rejected Labour's deal. It has voted on and rejected a customs union, and it has voted on and supported leaving with a deal. It's time this Parliament faced the consequences.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Mr. Speaker, the last time the Prime Minister tried her meaningful vote, she only managed 242 votes, slightly up on the previous attempt, but nevertheless a decisive rejection. Our plan received 296 votes, rather considerably more than that. Mr. Speaker, her government is in chaos. She's ignored the House, ignored trade unions, ignored businesses, and ignored the concerns of communities all around the country. She told the House that the EU would only allow an extension of Article 50 if there was a clear purpose. She's travelling to Brussels tomorrow morning to meet the EU summit leaders. What is her clear purpose?
I think if the right honourable gentleman had listened to the answer I gave to the first question that was posed in PMQs, he would have heard that.
Well, it wasn't clear at all, Mr. Speaker, other than she's going to try again with what we'll now term MV3. Surely, after two big rejections by the House, she must have noticed there isn't much support for the deal that she negotiated. So we learned this morning, Mr. Speaker, that she's only going to ask for a short extension, which directly contradicts what the Cabinet Office Minister told the House, saying in the absence of a deal, seeking such a short and critically one-off extension would be downright reckless and completely at odds with the position this House adopted only last night. So who is downright reckless here, Mr. Speaker? The Prime Minister ploughing on with an unachievable, unsupported deal, or others in this House who want to achieve something serious and sensible to prevent the damage to the British economy, jobs and living standards all over this country.
The right honourable gentleman talks about trying to achieve something sensible. It's the right honourable gentleman who last week abstained on a vote of a second referendum, despite the fact that it's Labour Party policy, and then had the nerve to stand up in this House and say he reiterated their support for a second referendum. He has no idea what he wants on the future of this issue. He asks about a long extension. He asks about a long extension. I'm opposed to a long extension. I don't want a long extension. Setting aside the issue that a long extension would mean we would have to hold the European parliamentary elections, which I don't think is in anybody's interests. The outcome of a long extension would be endless hours and days of this House carrying on contemplating its navel on Europe and failing to address the issues that matter to our constituents. Their schools...
Order. The answer from the Prime Minister must be heard, and everybody else will be heard. The Prime Minister.
The outcome of a long extension would be this House spending yet more endless hours contemplating its navel on Europe and failing to address the issues that matter to our constituents, schools and hospitals and security and jobs. This House has indulged itself on Europe for too long.
Order. There's a lot of very noisy barracking. Order. The Prime Minister's reply will be heard, and colleagues know that I am happy for the exchanges to take place for as long as is necessary to ensure that they are orderly. The Prime Minister.
It's time for this House to determine that it will deliver on Brexit for the British people. That's what the British people deserve. They deserve better than this House has given them so far.
Mr. Speaker, to describe the parliamentary process as one of indulgence doesn't show much respect for the democratic process that sent us here in the first place. The House, Mr. Speaker, has twice rejected the Prime Minister's deal. She's trying to come back for another attempt on Monday. Further to your ruling last Monday, she's got to come up with something a bit different than she's come up with so far. So what significant changes will there be, either to the withdrawal agreement or the political declaration, that will even allow the Prime Minister to table it on Monday?
Well, the right honourable gentleman talks about respect for democracy. Respect for democracy means that this House should deliver the Brexit that the British people voted for. And the right honourable gentleman now wants to disrespect democracy by holding a second referendum. It is not this government that is being disrespectful of the British people. It is the right honourable gentleman and his Labour Party.
Jeremy Corbyn!
The job of Parliament is to hold government to account, and the Prime Minister doesn't seem to understand that. When she was first defeated, she promised legally binding changes. I haven't seen those legally binding changes. All she's doing is running down the clock after a second heavy defeat. Today, Mr. Speaker, marks 1,000 days since the referendum. And this government has led the country and themselves into crisis, chaos and division. We are still legally due to leave the European Union in 9 days' time. Months of running down the clock and a concerted campaign of blackmail, bullying and bribery has failed to convince the House, or the country, that her deal is anything but a damaging national failure and should be rejected. They've run out of time. They've run out of ideas. People, Mr. Speaker, all over this country are anxious and frustrated with this government's utter inability to find a way through the crisis. If the Prime Minister cannot get changes to her deal, will she give the people a chance to reject the deal and change the government?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, I think he's actually just made the point that I was making in my previous answer to him, that he doesn't want to actually respect the vote that took place in the referendum in 2016. We have a deal that keeps millions of livelihoods safe and secure. It protects the union for the future. It means murderers and rapists on the run can be brought back quickly to face justice in this country. No deal won't do that. The deal is good for this country. It delivers Brexit and it should be supported.
Peter Aldous!
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The announcement this week of the closure of Co's Lowestoft shop, following on from those of Beale's, Argos and Body Shop, highlights the challenges that the High Street in Lowestoft currently faces. To address these, Waveney District Council are submitting an expression of interest to the Future High Street Fund, which I anticipate will be heavily oversubscribed. I acknowledge the various initiatives the government have put forward, but can the Prime Minister assure me that a coordinated, sustained and properly resourced approach, working with councils, will be pursued to revitalise our town centres, which are so vital to local communities and economies?
Well, first of all, my honourable friend makes an important point about the significance of town centres for our local communities. Can I say to my honourable friend, thank you also for highlighting the work that we are doing, the help we're providing through the Future High Streets Fund. Of course, high streets are changing, but we want to help them in that process and help them to adapt. That's why, as he said, the Future High Streets Fund is there. It has £675 million available to support local areas. But I'd like to also reassure my honourable friend that in doing this, we will be promoting partnership across the public and private sector, including local businesses, in developing those plans for the future of their high streets.
Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister on the outrage that we all feel from what happened in Christchurch in New Zealand? We must work collectively together to drive hate out of our societies across the globe. And our thoughts are very much with the people of Mozambique, with Zimbabwe and those from Malawi. And we must do all we can to support those in those communities. Mr. Speaker, all our constituents will be watching on at the crisis and chaos that we're in, and we need to reflect on the fact that we are a week away from what is the intended day from leaving the European Union and the responsibilities that we all have. Mr. Speaker, 6 days ago, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster said, in the absence of a deal, seeking such a short and critically one-off extension would be downright reckless. Downright reckless, Prime Minister. Does she agree with her de facto deputy that her actions this morning are downright reckless?
As I have set out clearly for the House in a number of answers that I've now given on this question, I believe this House has a responsibility to deliver on the Brexit. People voted for Brexit. We have a responsibility to deliver. I recognise that the Right Honourable Gentleman and his colleagues in the SNP have always taken the position they want to revoke Article 50 and not have Brexit. The Honourable Gentleman shouts correct from a sedentary position. At least that's a firm position, which is different from the Leader of the Opposition, who has continually moved his position on this issue. But I also believe that nearly 3 years on from the vote having taken place to deliver on Brexit for the British people, it is time for this House to face that fact, to face the consequences of its decisions, and to deliver on Brexit for the British people.
Order! We can't have people shouting out in the middle of the exchanges. Order! I don't need any help from any member in dealing with these matters, with which I'm very well familiar. The Prime Minister. Grateful to us. He had two. Yeah, he's had two. Mr. Peter. No, sorry. Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say to the Prime Minister that we need to reflect that her deal had the biggest defeat in parliamentary history. She brought it back. It had the 4th biggest defeat in parliamentary history. Her deal has failed. This House has voted against no deal. Once again, the Prime Minister is acting in her own self-interest, not in the interests of the whole of the UK. The Prime Minister has failed. This place has failed, and Scotland is watching. The only way forward now, Mr. Speaker, is to put the decision back to the people. Will the Prime Minister give the people a say in such a referendum? Mr. Speaker, the people of Scotland deserve a choice over their future. If Westminster fails, Scotland will act.
Can I say to the Right Honourable Gentleman that there is an enormous responsibility. It's a huge honour and privilege to sit in this chamber, to be elected as a Member of Parliament, to represent our constituents, and we all have a responsibility. And this Parliament gave the decision to the British people. It took place in a referendum in 2016, and the result of that referendum was that we should leave the European Union. And the result of that referendum was that we should leave the European Union. And I believe for people to be able to have trust in their politicians and faith in this Parliament, it is imperative that this Parliament delivers on the Brexit that people voted for.
Mr. Peter Bone.
Mr. Speaker, in June 2016, the country voted to leave the European Union. In February 2017, this House voted by a majority of 384 to trigger Article 50. The Prime Minister in this House has said on 108 times that we will be leaving the European Union on the 29th of March. Last week, 2/3 of her MPs voted against any extension to Article 50. Prime Minister, if you continue to apply for an extension to Article 50, you will be betraying the British people. If you don't, you will be honouring their instruction. Prime Minister, it is entirely down to you. History will judge you at this moment. Prime Minister.
Order. I'm not having the honourable gentleman denied the chance and the right to be heard. The honourable gentleman must and will be heard. Mr. Peter Bone.
Prime Minister, which is it to be?
Can I thank my honourable friend has been consistent in his challenging me on the 29th of March date in Prime Minister's questions and in statements and indeed in debates. I have always wanted us to be able to leave on the 29th of March. But I believe, as was said during the referendum campaign by those who wanted to leave, that it was better to leave with a negotiated deal with the European Union. Yes. That is why I am saying that I think we should look again at being able to leave with a negotiated deal, but in order to do that, we need time for this Parliament to ratify a deal, and in order to do that, we need an extension until June the 30th. But as I have said, as Prime Minister, I could not consider a delay further beyond the 30th of June. This is the point at which this House has the decision to take as to what it wants the future to be. That is what is facing this House, and that is a decision I believe we should take, honouring the result of the referendum.
Dr. Roberta Blackman-Woods.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On Friday, I visited a school in my constituency where distressing poverty means that teachers are not only providing food for the children at breakfast and lunch, they are sourcing clothes and buying shoes for them, in addition to raising money for books and equipment. Now that school, the only one in the area, is threatened with closure. So rather than spending money trying to get people to back her Brexit deal, could I ask the Prime Minister, please, to use it to address the acute social need in this country that is bringing families and communities to their knees?
Well, the Honourable Lady will be well aware that we are putting more money into our schools. We are ensuring that we have a welfare system that does encourage people into the workplace, and we have put more money into various other elements of care for people across our communities. The best solution for people to ensure that they are able to provide for themselves and their families is for us to have a strong economy and for people to be helped into work. And that's why it was so pleasing to see this week that we see, yet again, employment levels at a record high in this country.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To overcome homelessness, we need more homes. And in Chelmsford, we're building 1,000 new homes every year. But we also need the infrastructure. So this week, Essex County Council is putting in bids for housing infrastructure funding, including the second train station in Chelmsford. Does my right honourable friend agree that world-class infrastructure is vital for our future? And will she support our 25-year campaign for Chelmsford's second train station?
Can I say to my honourable friend, first of all, I welcome the action that Essex County Council has taken in relation to new homes. I welcome their bid to the Housing Infrastructure Fund. It's important we've made that money available in the Housing Infrastructure Fund because we understand the importance of infrastructure for new housing developments. We recognise the need for additional affordable housing in the South East. Of course, the Department for Transport will look very carefully at the bid which will come in for the second railway station that my honourable friend has referred to. But I'm pleased to be able to say that we're only able to do this because this is a government that is putting record levels of money into capital investment in our country.
Lloyd Russell Moyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the Prime Minister campaigned to keep Section 28, which banned LGBT people being talked about positively in schools and led to millions of young people like myself growing up in fear of being LGBT. I thought the Prime Minister had seen the error of her ways, but this morning the Leader of the House said on radio that parents should decide when they're exposed to LGBT education. This is Conservative Party dog whistle politics. Will the Prime Minister condemn the Leader of the House? Will she condemn bigots that don't want LGBT people to be heard in schools? And will she support Ofsted with good LGBT education in our schools?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, I'm very happy to write to him with the detail of the guidance that is given to schools on LGBT education and teaching. I think it is important. My right honourable friend, the Minister for Women and Equalities, Secretary of State for International Development, has been at great pains to ensure, working with the Department for Education, that appropriate guidance is given to schools. And I will write to him. I recognise the issue that the honourable gentleman has raised, and I will write to him with the details of the guidance because it is very clear about what is appropriate.
Derek Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Cornwall, we want to be as environmentally friendly as possible. In fact, we want to be carbon-free by 2030. For me, this means improving the quality of our homes. It means making use of all forms of renewable energy and ensuring sustainable food production. Will my friend, the Prime Minister, welcome the aspirations of communities like Cornwall, and will her government ensure that robust policies are in place to meet net zero emission commitments more quickly?
Well, I thank my honourable friend. Certainly, I'm delighted to hear of the aspirations that Cornwall has in relation to being carbon-free and the action that is being taken. We're happy to support that. We have a good record on climate change as a government, but we're doing more. Our annual support for renewables will be over £10 billion by 2021. Our ambitious clean growth strategy sets out our plan for decarbonising the UK economy through to 2032. So we will be putting in the policies in place that will enable areas like Cornwall to be able to achieve their commitment in relation to climate change.
Alex Norris.
Mr. Speaker, 4,621 words in the Chancellor's spring statement, but not a single mention of waspy women. The Prime Minister came to office vowing to tackle burning injustices. Well, these women worked all their lives for their pension and had it taken from them without their knowledge. Does the Prime Minister really not think this is a burning injustice?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman that he knows full well in relation to the issue of the waspy women that this is a government that did put extra money in. We've been very clear no one will see their pension age change by more than 18 months relative to the 1995 Act timetable, and those with the most significant changes did receive at least 7 years' notice. But we do want to see the empowerment of women in the workplace, the empowerment of women in our economy, and that is why my right honourable friend, the Minister for Women and Equalities, will be bringing forward a strategy on that very soon.
Bill Grant.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The United Kingdom average unemployment is at a remarkable 4%, a very welcome low. In Air Carrigan Cumnock, however, it stands at 6.5%. Can my right honourable friend give an assurance to my constituents that she will continue to work in building employment nationally with a particular focus on areas where unemployment is significantly higher than the UK average?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend that he has raised a particularly important point? If I may just pull him up on one point, actually we have now seen that the employment rate across the UK is 3.9%, not 4%. Unemployment rate across the UK is 3.9%. Employment in Scotland has risen by 239,000 since the 2010 election, and what we've seen in the spring statement was our economy growing every year, borrowing lower than expected, debt falling. But I absolutely recognise the concerns my honourable friend has raised. That's why we will continue to work as a UK government to deliver more jobs, healthier finances and an economy that is fit for the future across the whole of the United Kingdom.
Malhotra.
Mr. Speaker, hate crime is on the rise and our democracy increasingly based on fear both in Parliament and the country. Shocking Home Office figures show that hate crimes doubled from 2011 to over 100,000 last year. The country looks to politicians to set a high standard. But last week, the Prime Minister's allies were texting fellow honourable members saying, "I'm going to chloroform you and drag you through the lobbies to vote for the Prime Minister's deal." Does she find this behaviour acceptable, or will she be removing the whip from the offending member?
Can I say to the honourable lady? Can I say to the honourable lady that she is absolutely right that politicians at all levels need to think very carefully about the terms in which we address others and the terms in which we put our arguments. And there are many members across this House who have suffered significantly from verbal abuse, from abuse online of various sorts. This is a matter that we should all be taking seriously, and I will be ensuring that across this House we work to ensure that people are not subject to the sort of abuse that sadly some members of this House have been subject to from outside this House.
Tim Lawton.
Mr. Speaker, back in the world beyond Brexit, she'll be aware that my Civil Partnerships Private Members Bill completed its stages. Since when I've received hundreds of letters of thanks, including no fewer than 6 from prospective civil partners who proposed after my bill went through, and many from anxious mothers wanting to know when they will be able to sign their son or daughter's marriage certificate. So will she guarantee that every effort will now be made to ensure that these measures come in well before the end of the year and that there will not be a prolonged period of implementation?
Can I thank my honourable friend for the legislation and for working with the government on that legislation? And can I say to my honourable friend that we are working to bring this in as quickly as possible to ensure that the measures that are in that legislation are available as soon as possible to people.
Catherine West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Since the Prime Minister has been on her feet, the national crisis appears to have deepened, in that the EU Commission says that either it's an extension until the 23rd of May or until the end of 2019. Yes. Will the Prime Minister listen to the hundreds of thousands of young people who will march peacefully to Parliament Square to say that they would like to have a chance to have their say in this debate and put it back to the people, subject to the Kyle and Wilson amendment, which is basically a compromise in this House?
Can I say to the honourable lady, I've answered many questions in recent weeks and months on the question of putting a vote back to the people of this country. I continue to believe that it is for this House to recognise that, having asked people their view, having heard the view from those people, that we should actually deliver on that view. That is our responsibility. It's about delivering Brexit.
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, as the Prime Minister says, this House has voted clearly to reject leaving with no deal, and it's voted clearly to seek an extension if her withdrawal agreement cannot get a majority. But this House has not yet had the opportunity to debate and vote on the range of options for long-term arrangements, such as customs union, regulatory alignment and so on. So would she arrange next week for indicative votes finally to be held so we can see where the consensus, where the majority lies, because a short extension of Article 50 will be completely useless if the government goes into it with no idea of what it's going to have the authority to negotiate in the long term.
Well, can I say to my right honourable and learned friend, I think he will have noticed the House has had many opportunities, actually, to put forward motions of the issue that he has. Yes, the House has. The House has rejected alternatives to the government's deal. The House has voted against a customs union. The House has voted against having a second referendum. The House has, from a sedentary position, somebody on the opposition front bench says, we won't let the House. The House has voted on these issues and has rejected them. We have been clear about our intention to absolutely fulfil the requirement that we have to bring forward an amendable motion under Section 13(4) of the Withdrawal Act, and we will indeed be doing that.
Stephen Giffins.
Mr. Speaker, my constituents Tasnim, who's 7, and Hashim, who's 9, have been stuck in war-torn Sana'a, seeing things that no child should ever see. They managed to get out, and the government's asked them to go to Khartoum in Sudan, where they've been asked to wait until their mum can pass an English language test. Now, they have a safe home in Cooper in my constituency with their dad. I've briefed the Prime Minister about this. Will she let the family, all of the family, go home to safety in my constituency?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, thank you, and I thank him for writing to me with details of this case and for bringing it to my attention. Obviously, I mean, as he will expect, when the Home Office receives applications, they look at them carefully, they look at exceptional circumstances. What I have done is ask the Home Office to look urgently at this case and ask the relevant minister to respond to the honourable gentleman as soon as possible.
Sir Oliver Letwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister knows that if she brings her deal again to the House, I will again support it. But will she confirm today that the full length of the extension she is seeking from the EU will be available to the House, regardless of whether it supports her measure or seeks another way forward?
Well, can I say to the honourable gentleman, as I think he will have heard me say in my answer to the very first question that was posed in Prime Minister's questions today, the government intends to bring forward proposals for third reading vote. If that vote's passed, the extension will give the House time to consider the withdrawal agreement bill. If not, the House will have to decide how to proceed.
Jed Killen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over 50 years since the closure of J&J White's chemical factory in my constituency, the local area is still blighted by carcinogenic hexavalent chromium contamination. To date, Clyde Gateway has received £6 million of EU funds to decontaminate and regenerate land, but tens of millions more will be required to complete the work. Will the Prime Minister give a commitment that post-Brexit, the UK Government will make similar funding available in the long term to complete that work?
The honourable gentleman has raised a very specific case with me in relation to a certain type of funding. I'd be very happy to ask the relevant minister to respond to him on the specifics of that case in relation to his constituency.
Sir William Cash.
Will my right honourable friend rule out introducing the withdrawal and implementation bill if her withdrawal agreement is voted down yet again by the House next week, and then let the United Kingdom leave the European Union on the 29th of March as the people's vote in 2016, as Parliament has enacted and as the law requires?
I say to my honourable friend, what I have done today in writing to President Tusk is ask for that extension to Article 50 to the end of June. I've been clear that that is, as I've said, that I don't believe Brexit should be delayed beyond that point. That would give us the opportunity to ensure that the House can consider again a deal and then take forward the withdrawal agreement and implementation bill in the circumstances that a deal was passed. In the circumstances that a deal was not passed, then it would be necessary, obviously, for the House to consider, as I've just said, to our honourable friend, the right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset, how we should proceed. I would also say to my honourable friend, as he will have heard the DEFRA Secretary saying in the debate on no deal last week, there are particular issues, particularly in relation to the governance of Northern Ireland, in relation to leaving the European Union without a deal on the 29th of March. I continue to hope and continue to believe that the best way for this country to leave the European Union is to do so on a basis of a negotiated deal, and the extension to 30th of June would allow us to do that.
Ed Miliband.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to the question from the Father of the House, does the Prime Minister not realise that in her answer she is the roadblock to this House reaching a majority, not the facilitator of it? It is blindingly obvious, including, I believe, to members of the Cabinet, that what the House now needs to do is have a series of indicative votes, precisely so it can express its will about what it is for, not simply what it is against. Why doesn't the Prime Minister agree to that? And she would be doing the service to the country if she did.
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, obviously I've made clear that we will bring forward the motion that is required under the legislation under section 13(4). But if I could just gently say to the right honourable gentleman, as I did to my right honourable and learned friend, that it is not the case that it has not been possible for this House to bring forward votes of the sort that the right honourable gentleman is talking about. It has been open to this House. In some cases, the House has brought forward such votes, and those have been rejected.
Mr. Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend and this House gave its solemn word to the British people that we would leave the EU on the 29th of March, on Friday week. If this extension happens, my right honourable friend, what guarantee can you give the British people that at the end of June, if we still do not have a deal, we honour that referendum result and we leave?
Can I say to my honourable friend that I made clear in the debate we had, I think in the debate we had, one of the debates last week or the previous week, that if it is the case that there is an extension, this does not actually take no deal off the table. It leaves that as a point at the end of that extension. Now, whether or not we have that extension is not a matter purely for the United Kingdom. It is a matter for the European Union Council. They have, up until now, been very clear, and obviously I wait to see what they say tomorrow, but they have been very clear that any extension could only be if there was a clear purpose for that extension, and that we could not we could not go beyond the date I've suggested without holding European parliamentary elections. I don't believe it's in anybody's interest to hold European parliamentary elections. I believe it is time that we actually delivered on the vote of the British people in 2016, and that's why, as I said earlier, in response to the first question, as Prime Minister, as far as I'm concerned, there would be no delay in delivering Brexit beyond the 30th of June.
Anna Seabury.
As the Prime Minister has told us, she is today seeking a short and one-off extension to Article 50. Last Thursday, her Deputy Prime Minister told this House at that dispatch box that any such application would be downright reckless and completely at odds with the position that this House adopted only last night. The question is, Prime Minister, what changed?
Here. Can I say to the Right Honourable Lady, I seem to see a certain similarity between her question and a couple of the questions that came from the official opposition on this issue. But as I said to them, I think we should all remember the responsibility we have in this House to ensure that we deliver Brexit. And as I have said, I believe a short extension of the type that I have indicated, that I've written to President Tusk about today, is a sensible request to put forward. But I've also been clear, as I have in response to my honourable friend from the backbenches, that I also believe that the British people will not thank this House. They will not thank this House if we do anything other than deliver Brexit and in a reasonable timetable, and that's by the end of June.
Mr. Nicholas Bowles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my right honourable friend for allowing me to continue to represent the people of Grantham and Stamford from these Conservative benches. On the 26th of February, my right honourable friend said from the dispatch box, and I quote, "If the House votes for an extension, the Government will seek to agree that extension approved by the House with the EU and bring forward the necessary legislation to change the exit date commensurate with that extension." When will she give this House the opportunity to approve her extension request? When will she bring forward the necessary legislation to change the exit date?
Well, the suggestion of the extension to the end of June was, of course, considered by this House last week. It is necessary, before it is possible for that to be confirmed, and the request has gone into the European Union Council, before that request can be confirmed, it is, of course, necessary for the EU Council to agree that extension, because the treaty is clear that an extension can be applied for by the party, the country that is leaving the European Union, but it has to be agreed by all 28 members of the European Union, and that will not be possible until the European Council at the end of this week.
The Prime Minister still has to ask the EU to agree to something, and at the moment all she's asking anybody to agree to is the same plan that she has put to this House twice and that has been roundly defeated twice. Why will she not just open up, just think again, just allow the indicative votes that others have put forward? Because what she is doing by sticking to this failed plan is deeply dangerous for our country. In the national interest, I beg this Prime Minister to think again.
What is first and foremost in the national interest is for this country to leave the European Union, and to do so in a way that does protect people's livelihoods and protects their security and protects our union. That is the proposal that we have put forward. The Right Honourable Lady has raised again the issue of indicative votes. As I will say to her, as I've said to others, first of all, we stand by the requirement that we have to bring the motion under 13.4 of the Withdrawal Act, which we will do, and we will bring that motion to this House. And it is appropriate within the timetable set within the legislation. But I also say to the Right Honourable Lady, it is the case that there have been votes in this House on some of the other proposals that have been put forward, and those have equally been rejected. There is one thing that this House has agreed to, and that is that it would leave with a deal. It was in relation to changes in relation to the backstop. and that is the one positive vote that the House has given.
David Duquette.
Much, Mr. Speaker. After much representation from the charity Max Appeal, the National Screening Committee is for the first time considering adding 22q11 syndrome to the newborn blood spot test. This second most common chromosomal disorder after Down syndrome can lead to avoidable mental health issues if not diagnosed and managed from a young age. So, therefore, would my right honourable friend join me and the APPG, of which I am chair, in calling for this condition to be added to the newborn blood spot test?
Very good. Can I say to my honourable friend, first of all, can I commend him and the APPG for the work that they are doing in this area. He's obviously raised a very important issue. I will ask the Department for Health and Social Care to respond to him, appropriate minister to respond to him, and possibly to meet him and talk to him about this issue.
Angela Eagle.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has a very selective view of the decisions that this country has made. She mentions the referendum, but she never mentions the general election, which denied her the authority for a hard Brexit.
Remove the authority.
She's mentioned the things that this House has voted against, but failed to mention that her deal has been defeated by large amounts now twice. And she seems determined to plough on as if nothing has happened to her deal and cause a huge crisis. Surely now, Mr. Speaker, the time is for the Prime Minister to recognise that she has to stop banging her head against the brick wall of her defeated deal and reach out across this House in the interest of stability and our democracy and come to a deal which actually has the support of a majority of this House rather than kowtowing to her own Brextremists.
The point is that so far, apart from saying that it would support leaving with a deal with changes to that deal in relation to the backstop, the House has given no positive vote on what it wants to go forward, and there we are. And I would also remind the honourable lady, she talks about the 2017 general election. I would also remind her that 80% of the votes cast in that general election. No, it's no good Labour members going like this. 80% of the votes cast in that election were cast from parties that stood on a manifesto of honouring the result of the 2016 referendum.
Oh, very well. If it appertains to matters of which the House has just treated, I'm willing to take it now. If it does not, I won't, because there's a proper time for such matters. It does relate to matters of which we've just treated. Point of order, Mr. Stephen Doughty.
Mr. Speaker, it relates to the question asked by my honourable friend, the member for Brighton, regarding the comments made by the Leader of the House this morning on the radio regarding LGBT education, and it relates to forthcoming business later today. Mr. Speaker, you'll be aware that there is an important statutory instrument due to be debated on sex and relationships education and LGBT inclusive education, but obviously we understand that you have granted a number of urgent questions and there will be an SO24 application. What steps can we take to ensure that that debate is not lost and that we do have it so that we can debate the comments made by the Leader of the House and ensure that we have inclusive education across this country?
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for his point of order. The short answer to him is that, if I understand correctly, and I believe I do, the time for that matter is protected. That is to say, notwithstanding the duration of urgent questions and the possibility of a Standing Order number 24 debate, the House will get to consider that matter. And I hope that that brings a smile to the face of the honourable gentleman. Indeed. Does it relate to that of which we've just treated? Point of order, Caroline Flint.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing my point of order. It does relate to the discussions around the extension of Article 50 and the agenda this afternoon for the debate. Could the Speaker confirm for me that this will require us, any extension, to take part in the European Union elections, and we will have to lay the orders in this House before 11th of April so that local authorities can publish election notices on the 12th for the South West and Gibraltar and the 15th of April for the rest of the UK. We have a duty to make sure that if we're extending, we will take part in those European elections, and we need to lay the orders.
Grateful to the Right Honourable Lady, and she was as good as her word. It did relate to matters of which the House has just treated, but notwithstanding her beguiling invitation to me to pronounce on the matter, I genuinely don't think that it is for me to do so. It may very well depend on the length of any extension sought, and it does seem to me that it is a matter which must be pronounced upon by the government front bench in the course of upcoming exchanges. Now, if the Right Honourable Lady wants to be assured that she will have the opportunity to put that proposition directly to a minister, I think I can offer her that guarantee. So she will have her chance. But it's not a matter for the chair. We come now to, but I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Lady and to the honourable gentleman for their points of order. Order. Urgent question, Mr. Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Minister if she will make a statement on Britain's help to those caught up in the cyclone disaster that is afflicting southern Africa?
Minister Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will join with me in expressing shock at the loss and devastation following the deadly cyclone Idai across southern Africa. Alongside the Met Office, we have been tracking this cyclone, and supplies were pre-positioned in Mozambique. We have so far committed £6 million to respond to immediate needs. I'm pleased to inform the House that more tents and thousands of shelter kits have now landed in Mozambique. We have teams on the ground in each of the 3 countries affected, including humanitarian and relief experts. We're working with other international partners, including the UN and the Red Cross, to address immediate needs across the 3 countries.
Indeed. The Honourable Lady has completed her contribution, a preliminary contribution. We're grateful to her. Mr. Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This massive disaster, Mr. Speaker, has swept across southern Africa, in particular affecting 3 Commonwealth and suspended Commonwealth countries. The United Nations has made clear that hundreds of thousands of people are affected, and that this is heading towards being the worst weather-related disaster to hit the southern hemisphere. The President of Mozambique says 1,000 of his citizens have perished, and as we have seen graphically on our television from the reporting by the BBC's Fergal Keane, the important port city of Beira has been flattened, with almost all port structures destroyed and the collapse of bridges and roads. In Malawi, nearly 900,000 people have been directly affected, with many having lost everything. The dangers confronting those caught up in this disaster, Mr. Speaker, include the loss of everything they own, the difficulty of getting food and medicines through to those affected, the dangers of waterborne diseases, including cholera, due to the contamination of the water supply. The risk of starvation and famine are very real, with harvests destroyed and livestock drowned. I'm sure the Minister agrees that the UK has an important role to play, given our acknowledged international leadership in this area, and she has set out some of what we have already done. The strong support and generosity we know exists all across the UK for stepping up immediately when these hideous so-called natural disasters take place is worth bearing in mind, and of course the huge repository of expertise which exists within DFID and British NGOs and charities, which is respected all around the world and which was greatly boosted by the report on Britain's international emergency response, so brilliantly undertaken by the late Lord Paddy Ashton. Will the government note, Mr. Speaker, that the search and rescue response so far has been much slower than in the crisis in 2000? One of those who is today in Beira, who was also there in 2000, says the response then was 10 times as great for a much lesser disaster. Thousands of families, Mr. Speaker, remain stranded. A huge global response is now required, and the UK has a key leadership role to discharge in that.
Minister.
Well, can I start by congratulating my right honourable friend on securing today's urgent question, which has allowed us to echo the sentiments that he has so eloquently expressed in terms of our solidarity with the people of Mozambique, with Malawi and with Zimbabwe, who have been hit by what the United Nations has described as being potentially the worst cyclone ever to happen in the Southern Hemisphere. And I alluded in my opening remarks to the role played by the Met Office, which has actually been extremely helpful in predicting not only the likelihood of the positioning of the landfall, but also allowed us to pre-position some of the supply in terms of food, in terms of medicines, in terms of cholera kits, in terms of shelter, that is important in terms of securing a response. And he rightly alludes to the UK's leadership in this area. I believe we've shown that leadership by being one of the very first to announce additional funding to this disaster. He will know that we do have some of those experts already deployed on the ground, and he will be aware that I'm sure he will have heard from his contacts that the Disaster Emergencies Committee will also shortly be announcing a further appeal, and that I think the UK does, in terms of not only our Commonwealth friends, but our suspended Commonwealth friends, have a crucial role to play and are playing in terms of that leadership to the situation. I was, in fact, myself in Beira only last month, and was able to testify to the strength of the bilateral relationship, not only between ourselves and the people of Mozambique, but of course the strong link that exists between the city of Beira and the city of Bristol in the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I begin by echoing the Minister's feelings. I know that this House is united in our thoughts for the tragic impact of this devastating cyclone, which may be the worst ever disaster to strike the Southern Hemisphere. I welcome the £6 million relief effort from DFID, and I am delighted to hear that this is now reaching people on the ground. But we know that unless immediate action is taken to halt catastrophic climate change, extreme weather events such as this will become much more frequent. And we know that it is the poorest people in the global south who will suffer the most. This must be a wake-up call to governments everywhere to urgently deliver on Paris Agreement target of remaining below 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. And if we are serious about doing this, then we need to start reducing our own global carbon emissions now. So what is the government doing to ensure it does this? And another key component of the Paris Agreement was a commitment to address the devastation caused to poor nations by climate change through funding for loss and damage. What government support is being given to fund this strand of the agreement? And finally, Mr. Speaker, the ability of Mozambique to respond and rebuild from this disaster will be seriously impaired by the country's debt crisis, triggered by £2 billion of secret loans from London-based banks. What action is the government taking to ensure the London banks are held to account for their role in Mozambique's debt crisis, and will she work with partners to relieve the debt burden faced by Mozambique so the country can rebuild? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I can endorse what she was saying there in terms of the UK's important role to play in terms of leadership on climate change. The UK has already committed £5.8 billion during this spending review period to work with our international partners and in international climate finance. And we are able to show leadership not only in terms of our track record here in the UK, where the UK is one of the leading countries in terms of reducing its carbon emissions, but also to share some of the technical skills that we have here in the UK to address it, whether it's in the offshore wind sector, whether it's in the solar mini-grid sector. We hosted an event for African energy ministers only the week before last. And in fact, there was a representative there from the government of Mozambique. And through the City of London and the Green Finance Initiative, we have been able to bring in not only our own contribution, but a further $25 billion of climate finance, green finance, in over 90 different bond issues in 7 different currencies so far. She raised the issue of the role played by the City of London, institution in the City of London, in the scandal a few years ago about hidden debt in Mozambique. And she will be obviously aware that I can't comment on the specific details of the case, but I can assure her that the UK will commit to ensuring that there is an investigation, and that we obviously can't comment specifically on the exact details of that investigation publicly.
Sir Henry Bellingham.
Mr. Speaker, I declare my interest in the region. I certainly share the comments by my honourable friend and his sense of extreme urgency. He mentioned the 2000 cyclone, and in particular the massive damage done to Beira in particular. Lessons weren't learnt then about the need for permanent sea defences. When it comes to the reconstruction that she is promising, will she make sure that emphasis is put on installing permanent sea defences along the north-east coast of Mozambique?
Absolutely right. Minister.
Well, my honourable friend, it sounds as though he also has visited Beira, as I did, and he will be aware that the coastline of Mozambique is, I think, I'm right in saying, over 2,500 kilometres long. And I think there are ways that the coastline is particularly vulnerable. I think that building a sea defence in the situation where there is a cyclone that hits is probably not the #1 way in which the resilience of the area could be improved. At the moment, of course, in terms of Beira Port, that has sustained significant damage from this particular cyclone. Beira Airport, where supplies are now arriving, is also reduced in terms of its ability to receive flights, and indeed many of the roads surrounding Beira are also underwater, and the unfortunate fact is that the rain is still falling heavily. So this is a combination not only of water from the sea but also water from the sky, and I think there are things that can be done to secure resilience, but I think that a flood defence, as he will know as a Norfolk MP, along the entire coastline of Mozambique is probably not the most compelling in terms of value for money.
Chris Law. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the UN has described the cyclone Idai as possibly, and I quote, the worst ever disaster to strike the Southern Hemisphere. This is a place I've also personally visited and know quite well. It doesn't even bear thinking what it used to look like before compared to where it is now. And although the damage and death these cyclones have brought with them seem incomprehensible, this is just the beginning of the impact of increasing extreme weather we shall witness. Widely last year, the International Development Select Committee heard from Dr Alison Doig, who noted that the United Nations Framework for Combating Climate Change has 3 pillars to avert these disasters and deal with their impact. Those are mitigation, adaptation and loss and damage. Therefore, does the Minister agree that loss and damage of property is a huge consequence of climate change? And if so, why does the UK Government only allocate official development assistance spending to mitigation and adaptation? I'd also like to ask, can we no longer pretend that these are freak accidents? We're going to see them ever increasing. So therefore, can the Secretary of State agree that we're living through a climate crisis? And if so, why will this not be made a much more urgent priority of this government? And lastly, just to say, from these benches, we share our shock and sympathy with all those families affected in Mozambique, Malawi and Zimbabwe.
Hear, hear. Well, Mr. Speaker, I know that his committee, the committee on which he sits, is doing an important piece of work in terms of the department's overall approach to climate change. I look forward to hearing what his committee has to say. We gave evidence to his committee recently about the work that we're doing in the £5.8 billion worth of international climate finance. He will be aware that that has already helped 47 million people adapt to the impact of climate change, he will be aware that a lot of the work that we're doing is around resilience and is about ensuring that people are able to be more resilient to these kinds of more extreme weather events that climate scientists are predicting will occur. And we were recently praised in terms of the Independent ICAI's assessment of our work in saying not only that we were showing good strategic leadership, but also that the work that we were doing was effective. I agree that this is an important area on which we need to be focusing, but I can assure the honourable gentleman that we are continuing to play an important leadership role and spending a very significant amount of money in this area.
Mr. Roger Gale.
Mr. Speaker, one of the longer-term effects of disasters such as this is the loss of the livestock upon which people depend for their livelihoods to feed their families. My right honourable friend mentioned the Disasters Emergency Committee. There is not a single animal welfare organisation represented on the DEC. My right honourable friends seek to ensure that that shortcoming is addressed so that when people are able to return to their homes, they also have the livestock upon which they depend to return to.
My honourable friend is right to highlight that there will be an impact long after the waters have receded in terms of the ability for the local population to continue to have successful food markets, whether it's in livestock or indeed this is a particularly maize growing area, and so the early reports are that much of that maize crop has been damaged across the 3 countries. This is an absolute staple, and of course any damage to the maize crop and to the staple in terms of diet is going to have ongoing knock-on effects in terms of the food resilience of the local population, and this will be very much part of the work that we will be doing with our advisors to understand the impact on that and to see where there is an additional need for programming and international leadership.
Order, I say not just for the benefit of the House, but for that of those who are observing our proceedings beyond it, that we have 2 wonderful but competing examples of seniority in the House seeking to catch the eye of the Chair. The mother of the House, the Right Honourable and Learned Lady, the member for Camberwell and Peckham, immensely senior, very distinguished, very busy diary. But on the other hand, immediately behind her, we have the Chair of the Select Committee, a man of great seniority. So I have to be the arbiter of competing greats. Harriet Harman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the former International Development Secretary for bringing this matter to the House and say that I absolutely agree with all the points he raised. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question. And it's evident the commitment that the Minister brings to this. And it's also evident that everyone is dismayed about the scale of the problem. But can I just ask her about people who will be particularly distraught about this? And this is the people in this country who have come from Zimbabwe, Malawi and Mozambique, who have made their home here, who live and work here, bring up their children here, pay their taxes here and contribute to our commercial and public life, but who also are contributors through their remittances to these countries and are desperately worried about their friends and family caught up in this. Could she tell the House how she's going to engage with the diaspora communities to make sure that she understands the efforts they're trying to make and she'll help those efforts, and also that she informs them what her department is doing and listens to them, because often they will know what needs to be done. And I also pay tribute, of course, to the work of all the agencies and her department in this very difficult situation.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank you for putting at the forefront the sorority of Harriets in your calling of questions today. She makes an important point, which was also alluded to by my right honourable friend in his introductory question, around the links between the UK and people in Mozambique, in Malawi and in Zimbabwe. And she makes a very important point about the ways in which that we can work with the diaspora here. And I would make a commitment to honourable members that should colleagues find this to be useful, that I could convene a meeting for colleagues who have the opportunity, therefore, to make representations on behalf of their constituents about what specifically we can be doing to help differently, but also what information can be found about their relatives. And of course, I can do that either in a face-to-face meeting or, of course, always happy to take telephonic or letters of inquiry as well.
Paul Blackman.
Mr. Speaker, I congratulate my right honourable friend for bringing this important issue to the House. Indeed, the British public at a time of humanitarian crisis are always incredibly generous. What arrangements is my honourable friend making to ensure that the British public who want to contribute either money, food, clothing or other means of assistance can do so in a constructive way so that we can help these people that are facing a terrible crisis immediately rather than delaying anything?
Well, can I also add my tribute to the generosity of my honourable friends' constituents? And as I mentioned earlier, there will be a Disasters Emergency Committee campaign launch to raise money for this disaster, because as we have noted, not only is there a need for immediate relief, and that the UK has been at the forefront in terms of pre-positioning some of that relief, but also there will be an ongoing need to rebuild these communities and to help with some of the food access issues that have been raised by my honourable friend. And so I would urge constituents who want to make a contribution to await the imminent launch of that particular appeal.
Mr. Stephen Twigg.
Can I welcome what the Minister has said today, and as she described to the House, the Select Committee is currently looking at climate change. Rightly, the focus today is on the humanitarian relief and the immediate challenge, but of course what we know is the long-term development needs of these countries must not be forgotten. Can she say what DFID will be doing, working with other donors and the countries concerned, to ensure that Malawi, Mozambique and Zimbabwe can rebuild after this, and in particular with a focus on necessary health and education investment?
Minister.
Well, he's so right to point to the long-term nature of this work. So there is the short-term response that we need to put in place, but there needs to be a long-term strategic response. And as some of the very poorest countries in the world are some of the most vulnerable to climate change, Malawi, I think, is estimated to be the third poorest country in the world, Mozambique, the seventh poorest country in the world. It is therefore a special responsibility for those of us who are paying in terms of international climate finance to also make sure that we do whatever we can to encourage countries such as the ones that are affected here to be successful in bidding for some of those funds, and which is the reason we had the African Energy Ministers event. It's the reason that as part of our new approach to Africa, we are hiring a further 20 climate specialists across our African network to be able to help deploy some of that finance into these countries which are particularly vulnerable.
Neil Parish.
And thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And our helpful sympathy goes out to the people of Mozambique and Malawi and Zimbabwe. And of course, the point's been raised here that not only is it about feeding and saving people now, but it's also feeding them into the future. So fitting into not only the British community, but the British farming community, I'm sure we can actually help to get cattle and other things back into those regions. But my one particular point, Minister, I want to raise with you is that Zimbabwe Zimbabwe naturally is suspended from the Commonwealth because of corruption, because of bad governance and lack of democracy, and it's quite right to suspend them. But it's not the fault of the Zimbabwean people that they've got such a corrupted government. And what more help can we give Zimbabwe, because the country is very weak due to its lack of good governance and democracy.
Very good point.
Minister. Well, we have always been a steadfast friend of the people of Zimbabwe, and this year alone we will have programmed some £84 million worth of programming through the Department for International Development, none of which, I must emphasise, goes through the government of Zimbabwe, which is designed to help the most vulnerable, designed to help with education, designed to help with access to healthcare, and designed to help with some of the agricultural resilience work that I have alluded to. So he is absolutely right to put on record the steadfast friendship between the people of the UK, the people of Zimbabwe, people of Malawi and the people of Mozambique.
Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Isn't this another example of the devastating impact of climate change on the very poorest countries in the world? And although, as my honourable friend, the Chair of the International Development Select Committee has said, this is about the humanitarian debate today, but can the Foreign Minister tell us what the Foreign Office will be doing at the UN and other multinational organisations to press the case for not just redoubling our efforts on climate change, but retrebling them so these incidents don't happen in the future?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I was able to give evidence to his Foreign Affairs Committee the other day, and one of the things I was talking about in terms of our new approach to Africa was the increased emphasis that we're putting in terms of adaptation to climate change across particularly the poorest and most vulnerable countries in Africa. With regards to the UN specifically, he will be aware that the UK has been asked to lead the work in terms of resilience at the September UN Climate Summit, and so that is a piece of work that we are taking forward to show real leadership in that area.
Kate Hoey.
The Minister will know that eastern Zimbabwe, particularly around Chimanimani, has been completely devastated. Roads closed, nobody really being able to get in unless by helicopter. And of course, the special circumstances of Zimbabwe already mentioned by my friend from the other side of the House. And I wonder if she could just add a little bit more to what specifically our ambassador in Zimbabwe is doing and how we are actually making sure that we're really going to get that aid to the people who are going to need it most.
Minister.
Well, the Honourable Lady who chairs the all-party group on Zimbabwe will want to know that we have been at the forefront of trying to work with our partners to assess the scale of the need. The port of Beira is not just the port for a large part of Mozambique, but it's also the port which is most used by Zimbabwe and Malawi in terms of food imports and exports, and so therefore that is in addition a particular vulnerability. Now, I understand from those early assessments that reports from eastern Zimbabwe suggest that there has been a severe degradation in terms of the infrastructure as well, and how difficult it is to access all of the afflicted populations. We can't overemphasize enough how difficult it is for us to be able to reach people. The pre-deployed kits have reached